Well, good evening or good afternoon, it's a great opportunity for me to be back in Israel after a long time away. And before I begin, I first want to say thank you to the leadership of the IDC in Herzliya for inviting me to this year's World Summit, and especially to Boaz Ganor for his continued leadership in advancing the study of counterterrorism or terrorism and terrorism-related topics. The work done here by scholars and practitioners from all over the world is truly first class. It's an honor for me to be here. Almost every year for the last decade, analysts and officers of the National Counterterrorism Center, the organization I lead, have participated in the World Summit, and I believe this year is no different. But I think this is the first time that the leadership of NCTC has had that opportunity, and I'm extremely grateful to be here. I also know that on Sunday evening, the summit began with a ceremony of remembrance for the victims of terrorism, both for those who lost their lives on 9/11 and those who have lost their lives to terrorist attack all over the world. And it's clear to me that taking time to remember and to reflect is important. For those of us who are engaged in the profession of counterterrorism, it reminds us why we do what we do and why it matters so much. And so for many Americans who are involved in counterterrorism, that day, 9/11, represented a pivot point, both personally and professionally. After 9/11, most of us would never be quite the same as we were before that day, again, as I said, personally or professionally. Last Wednesday at NCTC, my organization, we held a remembrance event as well. Several officers of our center shared their personal stories of tragedy and loss from that terrible day. We also had a chance to hear from 3 individuals who were active participants in the events of that day. An NCTC officer who was on duty in the White House Situation Room as an intelligence analyst, a senior FBI agent whose office was only a few short blocks from the World Trade Center and who took part personally in the first wave of law enforcement response at Ground Zero, and a member of the Secretary of Defense's personal support staff, a man who helped keep our Pentagon functioning by making sure that we were communicating while under attack. Now, each of these men shared with my workforce very, very sad and terrible stories, but also very inspiring stories. And though they themselves wouldn't say this about themselves, each of them also demonstrated enormous courage that day in carrying out their duty, even as the United States was under attack in the homeland, something that had literally seemed impossible to America. Now, 15 years after 9/11, I would argue that it's important that we continue to tell these stories. And I looked around my auditorium at NCTC, and it was easy to see that many of our younger officers, counterterrorism professionals in their early 20s, probably have very little memory directly of the events of September 11. And so it's our solemn obligation to make sure that we share with them those memories and those experiences, and that we continue to do so when we reach the 20th anniversary, the 30th anniversary, and someday, of course, even the 50th anniversary. But that's not why I'm here today, and I'm pretty sure that's not why Professor Ganor invited me to come today. I'm here today because I want to share with you some thoughts about the terrorism landscape that we currently occupy. And I'm aware that the audience today that I'm speaking to and that you're a part of is a special audience. I realize I'm speaking to an audience of true terrorism and counterterrorism experts. This is a room full of partners and colleagues for me. And so with that in mind, I wanted to do 3 things this evening. First, I'll provide a very brief survey of the threat landscape, and I'll do that from an admittedly narrow American perspective. That's my job as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And in many ways, I would suspect this is the least interesting part of what I will say. It's something I do all the time in sessions with our Congress, with our media, and with the public at large in the United States. And I say it's the least interesting part of my talk because simple problem identification is the easy part of what we do. Talking about how challenging terrorism is during this new ISIS or ISIL-dominated age and about how hard it is to be a counterterrorism professional, that's pretty easy these days. But it's nonetheless clear to me that it's important that we're clear with ourselves about the challenges we are facing and how that challenge has evolved and changed over time. And hopefully by speaking clearly and precisely about the threat we face, we can help illuminate where we are already pursuing useful, effective counterterrorism strategies. And maybe in those cases, we just simply need to give those strategies more time to work the way we want them to work. But careful examination of the threat will also help us illuminate those areas where we really aren't grappling very successfully with the terrorism problem, and perhaps areas where we need a fundamentally new or different approach. So forgive me for starting out with a pretty conventional approach at the front, with a somewhat tactical description of the threat we're facing. But after that, I promise to be more interesting and hopefully more thought-provoking. So for the second part of my remarks, I'll offer my views on what we in the United States, from my perspective, are doing well after 15 years of serious investment in counterterrorism capacity, and also what we are not doing well, areas where we still need to perform much, much better. And third and finally, I'll wrap up by offering some ways to perhaps change the way we think and talk about terrorism and the threat it represents to our societies. I'll also apologize in advance if my remarks are excessively US-centric. We Americans, as you know, are often accused of being self-absorbed and self-centered, and that's never more so true than in an election year. But I'll at least share with you my thoughts on the threat landscape seen from my position at the National Counterterrorism Center. The current environment that we face, I would argue, the threat we in the United States face today is broader, wider, and deeper than at any point since 9/11. And simply put, there exists today a greater number of potential terrorist actors who aspire to do us harm than ever before. And it does not appear as if we have yet stopped the rate of increase in that extremist population globally. And yes, state sponsorship of terrorism by Iran and Syria continues to be a staple of our terrorism landscape. One other indicator of the wider, deeper, broader threat picture that I mentioned a second ago is the fact that the number of ISIL-related threats that we are managing is simply additive on top of everything else we were already dealing with in managing the threat of Al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations. And despite the sometimes all-encompassing focus by the media and even by governments on ISIL, Al-Qaeda and Lebanese Hezbollah, among others, continue to represent formidable challenges to our security, to the US, to Israel, and to our partners all across the Middle East and Europe. That threat landscape that we're dealing with is also more geographically expansive than it has ever been. We don't have the luxury of focusing on a select few overseas hotspots when we're trying to mitigate and disrupt potential threats. That person who aims to do harm to the United States could be found in Afghanistan or Pakistan, in Somalia or Yemen, in Iraq or Syria, in Libya or Mali or Nigeria, in Indonesia or the Philippines, or that person could be found in France or Germany or the United States, or the United Kingdom, or to be sure, even inside the United States and probably in any one of our 50 states. The innovations in the terrorist playbook that we tend to associate with ISIL or ISIS also contribute to this more challenging threat environment, and I'll cite just a few of them, and they are well known to this audience, and indeed they've been some of the subjects of some of your panels. The aggressive effort by ISIL to use modern communication tools and technologies to identify, recruit, and mobilize terrorist operatives. The ability of ISIL or ISIS to align their objectives with the local agendas of extremist populations around the world, thereby gaining access to a much larger potential pool of adherents. And the willingness of individuals inspired by ISIL ideology to act alone or in very small groups, using whatever tools and capabilities, however limited, are available to them. The growing capacity of terrorists to use secure modes of communication to advance their plotting, thereby narrowing the qualitative technological edge that we have always enjoyed over our terrorist enemies. The increasingly rapid maturation of plotting, and in some cases the dramatic shortening of the timeline between when a potential plot is conceived and when it becomes reality, what we call the shortened flash-to-bang ratio. And lastly, ISIL's ability to sustain a narrative of success and victory, even when things go badly for the group on the battlefield or they suffer serious setbacks. All of these factors that I've rattled off above combine to make the threat landscape more unpredictable, more unstable, and more volatile than we have ever experienced in the United States. And it's not only ISIL that is proving to be adaptive and innovative. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates continue to evolve and find new ways to threaten the United States and our partners. The result is that our law enforcement and counterterrorism professionals, particularly those with direct responsibility for protecting the homeland, are right now under greater pressure than at any point since 9/11. Another result, I would argue, is that our population finds itself much more focused on terrorism-related concerns than many of our foreign partners would expect. And we Americans probably are more focused on terrorism in ways that are still hard for others to understand when you look objectively at the relatively small number of American citizens who are killed in terror-related events each year. So that's the threat environment as I see it in a nutshell. More challenging, more unpredictable, and therefore in many ways more difficult to respond to than at any point since 9/11. But as I move on to the next part of my presentation, I hope I can provide some balance and perspective to what might seem like, at first glance, an excessively gloomy and dark threat assessment, because that's not where I want to leave the story. Because I do, in fact, think that there are ways in which we enjoy significant advantages over our terrorist adversaries, and we are, in fact, capable of responding effectively to this threat landscape. When I think back over the last 15 years, I can identify numerous ways in which we have dramatically improved our performance and our capacity to counter terrorism. The things we do well, I would argue that we do increasingly well, and in some cases exceptionally well. And I'll just briefly run through a couple of different categories where I think that progress is undeniable. First, in the intelligence field, and by that I mean both collecting intelligence and sharing it with those who need it in order to prevent terrorists from succeeding. And here our success can be seen across multiple dimensions. First, we continue to be aggressive and creative in collecting intelligence, using every available tool. And we share that intelligence across our various national security organizations in a very structured way, in a way that enables both analysis and effective operations. We learned from our mistakes before 9/11, and we operate very, very differently today. Indeed, the organization I lead, the National Counterterrorism Center, is a direct outgrowth of those lessons learned. Second, in the intelligence field, I would argue that our willingness and capacity to share intelligence with partners, and not just our close allies like the Five Eyes or countries like Israel, our willingness to share continues to expand dramatically and rapidly. We collect more, we share more, we do it more rapidly and with fewer impediments than any of us would have thought possible 15 years ago or even 5 years ago. Our intelligence partnerships with countries like Israel are deeper and more productive than at any point in our history. Third, we also do more to share that intelligence outside the federal government in the United States with the full array of state, municipal, and local law enforcement professionals who end up serving as our first line of defense in the homeland against terrorist attack. Not a single day goes by where there isn't some sort of substantive intelligence exchange or exchange of terrorism-related information between NCTC, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, with our non-federal partners around the United States. And this includes intelligence of the greatest and highest sensitivity, as well as material that we produced that is tailored specifically for our partners who operate in an unclassified environment and aren't equipped to handle classified information. So all of this means that even if the intelligence environment is in fact getting more challenging given encryption and other technological challenges, I still believe firmly that we hold the upper hand over our terrorist enemies in the intelligence field. Second area where I would argue that our success is undeniable in the United States is in the hard power part of counterterrorism work. And here I am talking very narrowly about the effort to find, fix, and potentially finish those terrorist actors who are most directly engaged in efforts to target Americans. Now, through years of experience in difficult operating environments all around the world, we've developed quite an impressive suite of capabilities, and our reach does extend potentially to almost every corner of the earth. Now, the success and capacity that we've built in this area is testament to the lessons we've learned since 9/11 about how to work together in a more integrated fashion, blending intelligence, military, diplomatic, and law enforcement capabilities into a single unitary toolkit, and partnerships with key countries around the world. Many of them present or represented in this room are also central to this effort. Now, I would be the first to admit that hard power by itself is not a fully sufficient response to our terrorist challenges. Killing or disabling terrorists is not a strategy unto itself. And there's certainly an argument to be had about whether there are costs associated with treating the symptoms of the disease, even as you are struggling to find a lasting cure for that disease. But it cannot be denied. I would argue it's unassailable that we have saved literally thousands of lives over the last 15 years with the efforts we have made to disrupt terrorists operating in their safe haven. And given that any president's first and most solemn responsibility is to protect the safety and security of American citizens, particularly from terrorist attack, the continued growth and development of our capacity to do just that is a source of pride for our CT community, our counterterrorism community. And it should be. Now, the third area I would cite where we have achieved significant progress over the last 15 years is in developing an extremely robust homeland security enterprise across all levels of government. And I won't tick through all of the different ways in which that is so, other than to say that I believe at the end of the day, we have succeeded in presenting ourselves as an extremely hard target to most terrorist groups operating around the globe when they think about the United States homeland. And we certainly know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to aspire to carry out significant attacks on U.S. soil. But we also know that they are extremely challenged to do so, and the obstacles to their success in the homeland are quite formidable. Indeed, the very fact that both groups now call on lone actors to act on their behalf speaks to the difficulty they perceive is tied to the project of organizing a traditional terrorist cell structure to carry out a homeland attack. That's not surprising that we have this homeland security apparatus, given the huge level of investment in homeland security and border security that we've engaged in as a country over the last 15 years. And I wouldn't argue that we've always spent that money or used those resources in the most efficient or effective way. But as we look back now on how unprepared we were as a country to respond to 9/11, the homeland security apparatus that I'm talking about is something in which Americans can take great pride. Now that's the good news, and having identified some areas where we have proven quite successful in our counterterrorism work, let me quickly highlight some areas where I see some real challenges or problems that remain, or where we haven't performed as well as we need to. The first area sounds technical, but it really isn't all that technical. It's something I would call identity management. As everybody in this room knows, our collective counterterrorism efforts rest on a massive platform of data that we have acquired about who exactly the terrorists are. It's the most tactically important thing we do in the counterterrorism world, figuring out who the bad guys are, with whom they are connected, and then trying to track their movement. We collect their names, we collect their identifying information so that we can prevent them from entering our country, prevent them from getting on an airplane, or if necessary, so that we can target them. And we've invested in the United States huge sums and enormous effort at doing this. But as one of my key advisors at NCTC tells me, we're still doing this in a way that is likely on the wrong side of history. We continue to invest in a largely name-based identity management system. And while names will always be a point of departure when it comes to establishing the identity of an individual, I would argue that we need to focus increasingly on biometric information. Given the skill and the agility that terrorists have shown in adapting to border security efforts all around the globe, the only choice we have is to move in the direction of a biometrically based system, effectively using such things as facial recognition, fingerprints, iris scans, and ultimately DNA. Now, doing this will require a huge investment in collecting, sharing, and integrating biometric information, both internally in the United States government and with hundreds of countries around the world. And clearly, we're going to have to do this in close cooperation with all of our partners around the world. And unfortunately, I would argue that we are nowhere close to this point yet. And as a result, we're likely going to be living with an increasing sense of vulnerability as terrorists grow more adept, more capable at fooling our name-based identity systems. Second area where I would argue that we are playing catch-up in counterterrorism is related to this, but it's more directly connected to the kinds of data that we are increasingly being called upon to collect, to analyze, and to share. And it used to be, just a few years ago, that the most relevant pieces of information needed to thwart a potential terrorist plot, at least from the American perspective, the most relevant pieces of information came from human intelligence reports, from signals intelligence reports, or some other form of clandestinely acquired intelligence information. And yes, these categories of information are still very critical to our success, probably now more than ever. Yes, we are going to need CIA and NSA and every other collecting organization in the United States intelligence community. But they're clearly not enough. And it may be difficult, I would argue, for some longtime counterterrorism intelligence officers or veterans to imagine, but in the current environment, we're increasingly finding that terrorism-related information is to be found in the open source domain, on social media platforms, and with other forms of publicly available information. Now, the volume of information in the categories and domains that I just described that might require analysis or exploitation is simply massive. And moreover, the pace of technological change has vastly outpaced the associated development of law and policy in this regard. This poses significant challenges as we attempt to get the balance right between privacy and security. These challenges in handling information, particularly information in the public domain, they impact everything that we do in the counterterrorism world. What information we collect, how we process that information, with whom we share it, how we hire, train, and equip our counterterrorism analysts, and potentially what legal authorities we seek from our Congress. And I dare say that our counterterrorism efforts end up being a petri dish for every hard question that our government already faces as we confront transnational threats and deal with the downsides of a globalizing economy. So suffice it to say that I still think we have a lot of work to do in this area of information management, particularly as the terrorist landscape continues to evolve. Now, the third and final area that I would cite as an area of underdeveloped capacity or performance involves our efforts to counter violent extremism, known as CVE, and particularly inside the United States. The good news here is I think we have invested a great deal in studying and understanding the processes of radicalization and the way in which somebody mobilizes to violence. We've also benefited from the exceptional work done by our partners in Europe and across the Middle East in terms of understanding how these processes plays out. The bad news is that we've had along the way to acknowledge that there are in fact a number of factors at play when an individual becomes a terrorist, that these factors are often highly individualized, and that there probably aren't simple antidotes or vaccinations that can be applied at scale. And I would argue that this shortfall is particularly troubling as we see the dramatic increase in the population of what we call HVEs, homegrown violent extremists, inside the United States. Now, as a federal government, we've recently taken steps to organize and resource more effectively our CVE, our countering violent extremism efforts in the homeland. We've put them under the leadership jointly of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. And my own view is that we have been successful in some very specific localized cases at helping provide communities with the information and tools that they need to identify potential extremists and to engage with them before they reach the point of actually becoming a terrorist. This kind of engagement can hopefully provide an off-ramp that takes an individual off of an inevitable pathway that might lead to becoming a terrorist. But the scale on which we are undertaking these efforts is still far too limited, and it's certainly not sized to tackle the kind of problem that we are facing increasingly with individuals inspired by ISIL to take action in the homeland. And there's still much we in the United States can learn from your experts and your practitioners all over the world, including some in this room and some here at the IDC. So speaking personally about the CVE set of challenges, the countering violent extremism set of challenges, I only wish that we had addressed these issues more aggressively at an earlier stage in our post-9/11 history, so that we would be further along in the process of building capacity and building CVE programs all across the country. And for that, I certainly own my share of the blame, as I was in a position at both the White House and at NCTC to have done more in this regard. And I wish I had exercised more leadership and demonstrated more creativity in this area. So that's a quick run through of the areas of strength and weakness that I see in our national CT efforts, and again, at least as seen from a narrowly American perspective. I'd like to finish now by talking just a bit about how we think and talk about terrorism in the United States, particularly as it relates to our own national strategies for countering terrorism. And in doing that, I'd like to try to make my own modest contribution to try and shift the policy conversation a little bit in a new direction. And one way to shift that conversation in a new direction might be to ask, how do we deny success to the terrorists, rather than asking, how do we defeat terrorism or defeat a particular terrorist groups? And I say that for a couple of different reasons. First, I would argue that asking the question in this way puts us in a much better position to control outcomes and to deliver the results we seek for our citizens. When we talk about defeating our terrorist enemies in the current CT environment, we may be in fact talking about something that is not achievable at any level of cost, effort, or investment that any of us would find acceptable. And that's because terrorism is increasingly not a problem or a national security problem or national security challenge that stands all on its own. The terrorism problem that we face today is fed by a complex set of social and political conditions that exist across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. And while conditions certainly vary widely across these huge swaths of territory that I just described, the list of factors that contribute to the terrorism problem generally includes sectarian rivalry and conflict, inadequate governance, economic underdevelopment, political instability tied to shifting demographics, and in some cases, an unhelpful overlay of classic state versus state competition by both regional powers and great powers. Now, taken as an analytic proposition, the idea that any single unified strategy could deliver a positive outcome or an end state across all of these different dimensions in areas as complex as the Levant or South Asia or North Africa, well, to me, that certainly seems like a stretch. And yet, we as Americans, when we articulate our counterterrorism strategies, we sometimes set out to do just that. We articulate strategies that purport to transform the regions from which the terrorist threat emanates, to create good governance and representative government where it currently doesn't exist, to create willing and capable state partners with whom we can work to address the terrorism problem, partners who will always act in ways consistent with our laws and our values. And in the hardest cases, we sometimes articulate strategies where the success of that strategy hinges on our ability to deliver a just and lasting outcome to a conflict that has persisted for decades, if not longer than that. And even more unhelpfully, we sometimes attach timelines and expected measures of success to these strategies that are measured in months or just a few years, when we could not possibly expect or hope to achieve results in that time frame. Now, my argument here is not that we shouldn't work as a country and as a community of international partners to address the underlying conditions that generate support for terrorist movements. We certainly can and we certainly must look to address those underlying conditions. Rather, I'm arguing that our definition of success in CT strategy needs to change in some ways, perhaps driven by a more sober and realistic sense of what is achievable in the near, medium, and even in the long term. And to my mind, the simplest way to do that is to flip the question so that we are focusing on denying terrorist groups what they seek, rather than focusing on eliminating terrorism in all its forms, or seeking to remake in a fundamental way the societies within which terrorists operate. And I would argue that denying terrorists what they seek is tied directly to the concept of resilience, something you know a little bit about here in Israel. I've occasionally talked about resilience, but it was only in preparation for this speech that I actually took the time to look up the definition in the dictionary. That doesn't mean you flip open a book anymore. That means you Google the word resilience, and then the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition pops up on your screen. And the definition I found in Webster's online dictionary proved particularly appealing to me. Webster's defines resilience as, quote, the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens. It's a definition that I find both simple but also elegant. And defined this way, I would argue that resilience is something that is certainly within our control. The greater our degree of resilience, the more obvious it is that we are able to respond and recover and rebound from terrorist attack, the more likely it is that we will render our terrorist enemies incapable of achieving their objectives. Now, as a governing principle, that certainly sounds simple, and yet we as Americans, I would argue, still have a long way to go in terms of our capacity to project true resilience. And as someone who spends most of my time focused on working with my partners in the United States to prevent the next attack, I feel like I probably need to do more to shape and influence how we respond and recover when those attacks inevitably occur. And for those of us in government and academia, this might mean changing the way we talk about terrorism and particular terrorist attacks, because our public clearly does follow our lead. If we tend to overreact, they will certainly follow suit. And I'll be the first to admit that saying this out loud is not easy, especially in an environment where we are expected to have zero tolerance for failure. And that's certainly the standard to which we hold ourselves in the counterterrorism community. We don't expect to fail, we don't accept failure. It's also difficult to be a champion for resilience given the sometimes toxic political climate that exists in the United States. Calling for a more resilient response to terrorism sometimes sounds like preemptive excuse-making by those who failed at their job of keeping us safe. But in reality, terrorism is only an existential threat if we let it become one, if we allow it to become that existential threat. So in the end, how we respond when attacked is probably what matters the most. And as President Obama has said time and time again, both publicly but also privately, when dealing with his senior officials responsible for counterterrorism, we must respond to terrorism always by being true to our values and to our laws. So I'll close now by simply stating what I hope by now is quite obvious. While all of the experience that we as Americans have with terrorism in the period since 9/11 is substantial and has improved our capacity and improved our performance. There's still very much the case that we can learn from others all around the world. That's what makes this World Summit, but not only this World Summit, but the gathering of CT professionals that it represents so important, and it's why I'm so glad to be here in Herzliya today. So thank you, Boaz. I wish you great success with the rest of the week's discussions, and I look forward to coming back in future years. Thank you.